This is the Dallas Morning News.
This episode is from an independent podcast hosted by the Dallas Morning News Opinion Team.
I'm Talmage Boston, and welcome to this edition of Cross-Examining History, published and promoted by the Dallas Morning News, where we explore America's fascinating past with our country's leading historians and thought leaders. For this podcast, I interviewed Fox News anchor and presidential historian Bret Baier on his new book, To Rescue the American Spirit, Teddy Roosevelt and the Birth of a Superpower, that's been endorsed by Doris Kearns Goodwin, Walter Isaacson, and Jay Winnick. His book came out on October 21st, 2025, and we did the program in front of a live audience in Dallas on October 30th, 2025. Enjoy.
I could argue that today's president is also a celebrity president. I mean, I think it's three. Just because, Teddy Roosevelt is at the time called a human cyclone, and he's doing speeches all over the country, and his energy is nonstop. And I think he jumps off the page with the anecdotes of his life. I mean, it's truly amazing, his long life and how many different chapters there are. That is really rich. John F. Kennedy, obviously the country was ready for the young family, and this is after Dwight D. Eisenhower. However, that first book, we talked about the transition and how important it was from Eisenhower to Kennedy. I think Reagan, being the actor and the communicator, really able to talk to folks, and that's a big thing that I found in all six of the biographies. It started with Eisenhower, 3 days in January, then Reagan, 3 days in Moscow about the summit with Gorbachev, and then 3 days at the brink with FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. Then I went to Ulysses S. Grant to rescue the Republic, and then last book was George Washington to rescue the Constitution, how essentially we don't have a country from the starting line without George Washington, and then this. What I tried to do in each one of these books is look at a soda straw moment in history that maybe was overlooked or undercovered at the time. And when it comes to Teddy Roosevelt, you could write Teddy Roosevelt books until you're blue in the face, but because there's so many stories and it's so rich. But this looks at why his legacy, he wanted his legacy to be that America is a global leader in the world, that America would be at the turn of the century respected in the world. And he does that by an effort to reach peace between two countries.
Now you say that there's many parallels between Teddy Roosevelt's time at the turn of the 20th century and our time early in the 21st century. For example, quote, you say, I'm sure Donald Trump approves of the way Teddy Roosevelt spoke his mind and fought for his principles. He would also find parallels in Roosevelt's ideas about executive power. So compare Roosevelt's approach to the use of executive power to Donald Trump's approach.
Yeah, so think about this. From the first president, George Washington, to the 25th, William McKinley, all of those presidents combined signed 1,200 executive orders. Teddy Roosevelt, the 26th president, signed 1,300 executive orders. Now, that is a massive expansion of executive power. And he often said that if the Constitution didn't tell him he couldn't do it, that meant he could. Which I think our current president operates on the same framework. Also, another similarity, both had assassination attempts. Another similarity, I mentioned the human cyclone element, and I can tell you, having ripped up rundowns for a news show 6 times through a day, because we're on our 5th press conference where news is being made, that there's an element of human cyclone with Donald Trump. Also, they're both enigmas when it comes to ideology. Teddy Roosevelt was a conservative and a Republican. He believed in capitalism. He believed in business, but he believed capitalism should be for everybody. So he did fight for the little guy. He did a lot in those executive orders about labor. He's the first president to get involved in a labor dispute, settling the coal miners' strike in 1902. He files 40 antitrust lawsuits against big business. J.P. Morgan was not a fan of Teddy Roosevelt. But at the same time, he creates the Panama Canal, the most big business element ever, because the trade throughout the world changes our ability as a world economy to succeed. So I think you could do that too. There's an enigma politically comparison. And finally, I think that the press and how they dealt with the press. Each person, President Trump and President Roosevelt, understood the power of the press. In each one of his jobs, Roosevelt is seen bringing a member of the press with him to document what he's doing. As New York City Police Commissioner, he works overnight to kind of fight corruption, and he has a guy with the newspaper that's kind of documenting all of this, and it gets in the papers. When he fights in the Spanish-American War with the Rough Riders, he goes down to Miami and gets a boat to take them over to Cuba and realizes that some reporters, the New York Times, some others, don't have transport. So he says, come with us, you'll embed with our group, which is why we have such detailed documentation of what the Rough Riders did, charging up San Juan Hill and all of that. Not to say that they weren't heroic and brave and didn't fight very hard, but we know it in detail because of reporters that were there, and he knew the power of that. There's another president that knows that, and he uses it very much. He calls them all kinds of names, totally fake news, enemy of the state. I tell you what, they're not that good. I don't get to do that on the show that much. But you're good at it. But Teddy Roosevelt called the reporters, he didn't like how they were reporting, he called them muckrakers. So anyway, there are similarities there are differences. But when I write these books, it's amazing. Now, this started well before this administration. I didn't know how he was going to act on the world stage or what he was going to do. But each one of these books and every lunch and breakfast we've had, there is a tie-in to the current time based on history back then. And it is all cyclical, I think. And we can learn a lot from the past to where we are and where we're going.
Theodore Roosevelt famously said, as far as foreign policy went, speak softly and carry a big stick.
That may be a contrast. Well, the big stick part we have, the speak softly part, that could be a contrast.
If you read when you read Bret's book, I don't think Theodore Roosevelt necessarily spoke softly, but he definitely carried a big stick. Mm-hmm. And I don't think Donald Trump speaks softly, but he certainly carried a big stick. So the question is the size of a president's stick more important than the volume of his words?
This is a PG audience, Talmage. When he says in that speech, speak softly and carry a big stick, he's talking about dealing with countries directly. In other words, the relationships that you have, make sure that they feel good, that they know that you are on the same page. Don't push them over in the press. Don't speak ill broadly of these leaders, even though they're doing bad things. Speak softly, but then make sure that they know you have the power to follow through with what you quietly say behind the scenes, like, I will bomb you if you do X, Y, and Z. Now, we don't know exactly what's happening behind the scenes with President Trump, but I can tell you that publicly, when he praises, I have a great relationship with President Xi, he's a wonderful person. Putin, we get along wonderfully, great time. Every time he says that, Putin attacks Ukraine again or something. But he is essentially doing what Roosevelt said. Speak softly about the relationship. Don't lambast them in the press. And when the big stick happens, in other words, the strike on the Iran nuclear facility, that sends a message to the world that you are going to back up with power. For Roosevelt, The thing I do the soda straw with is Russia-Japan is in a territorial war, and it's devolving into a world war. And Roosevelt says this is the chance for America to be on the world stage. So he reaches out to the leaders of Russia and Japan by telegraph and letter and says, I want to be the host for a peace negotiation. So he brings the delegations to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and he sets up all the logistics. And he essentially is the go-between. He works the delegations, and there's real differences, but over several days of intense negotiations, Roosevelt gets Russia and Japan to agree to a peace treaty, and the war ends. And for that, America is seen as being the solving partner of that moment, and also Teddy Roosevelt gets the Nobel Peace Prize. That puts us on the map. But then a few months later, Japan is rattling its saber again, kind of being a troublemaker. And Roosevelt says he needs to show the world how strong the U.S. is. So he takes, during his time, he builds up ships. He's one of the biggest investors of defense spending, another kind of dichotomy between progressivism and more conservative thought. He has this big U.S. Navy that is battleship gray, and he paints it gleaming white. All the ships are white, and he calls it the Great White Fleet. And he sends it out across the world as a show of force for all the countries to realize that America is on the world map. And as he sends it out, Congress essentially says, what are you doing? We are not paying for this. And he says, bully, I have money for it to go. I don't have money for it to come back, but I have money for it to go. And he has this big ceremony, and they're along the sides of the ships, and there's bands playing, and it's cloudy, but then the sun comes out, and the gleaming white ships take off. It is a sight for the press. Congress eventually comes around and provides the funding. They go around for 17 months. A quick aside, I was with a teacher, a history teacher, at one of these events, and she said, I taught this to my 11th grade history class about the Great White Fleet, and I had them write a paper, and one of the students came back and said that the Great White Fleet, Teddy Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet to circumcise the world. And she said, son, is that the right word? He's like, yes, circumcise the world. I think you mean circumvent the world, but anyway, I just thought that was a funny moment. Anyway, the desired effect happens. The fleet comes back 10 days before the end of his presidency, and the world realizes that the U.S. naval power of our country is very strong and a big deterrent of screwing with the U.S. going forward.
Now, you say that Theodore Roosevelt's, quote, true strength was his inner core, the uncorruptible center of his striving. So does that mean that he really did not like to compromise?
He did compromise. I think it's more about his moral upbringing. He got that from his father. His father was a big part of his life. And in his early upbringing, he was a really sickly kid. He had debilitating asthma. And he couldn't get out of bed. His mom didn't think he was going to survive, let alone thrive. And he spent the first few months, actually a few years, really inside behind a window because they didn't know what to do. And they had all these different theories about getting rid of asthma, and it was weird. They thought they could poison the asthma out of him. So they had him smoke these cigars, like really big cigars, and drink really heavy black coffee. Guess what? That didn't work. But his time, over time, he spent time outdoors, and that's what really allowed him to breathe, and he fell in love with the outdoors. An aside, we had this hour special on Fox Nation based on the book, and we found in the archives this amazing shot of Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession going up Broadway in New York, past the Roosevelt brownstone. And the window is open, and there are two kids in the window looking at the procession. And one of those kids is Teddy Roosevelt, looking out the window as Abraham Lincoln's casket is rolling by. And you just think about that, and it gives me, as a history nerd, goosebumps, because the next time those two leaders would be together is on Mount Rushmore. And history is cyclical like that. And anyway, from that debilitating kid, he fights it off, and it's his dad who really bucks him up and tells him, you've got to make yourself strong. He becomes a boxer. He spends life outside. He wants to be a scientist at that time. He collects birds and bugs and all kinds of things to create his own natural museum in the house. Now, if I'm a parent, I'm like, what are you doing? But obviously he had a tough time, and the parents probably said, oh yeah, go ahead, set up the natural museum in your room. And so he had dead bugs all the time, and he was collecting, and he had birds and entrails of animals and all kinds of stuff in his room. And he would travel. They were very well off. They traveled to Europe in the summer, and he would room with his brother Elliot. And Elliot went to his father. He said, Father, I can no longer room with Teddy. He said, why? And they're in the hotel. And he says, come. And they go to the room, and there are the birds and the bugs and the entrails and in the basin of the tub. And the father looked and said, Elliot, you can have your own room.
Now, your book is truly a cradle-to-grave biography. And as you point out, there's many intriguing aspects to Teddy Roosevelt's life. But one of the most intriguing was on February 14, 1884, both his mother and his first wife died on the same day in the same house. And thereafter, quote your book, he set out to obliterate his first wife Alice from his world. He destroyed her letters and their pictures, and he never mentioned her even in his autobiography. So, Bret, why did he attempt to obliterate the memory of his first wife from his memory?
This was the most devastating thing that ever happened to Teddy Roosevelt. Alice Hathaway was the love of his life. He called her Sunshine. He was at Harvard. They fell in love. They got married. It was the happiest he had ever been. She got pregnant. She went to New York City to have the baby. He becomes a state lawmaker, the youngest state lawmaker in New York. He is ecstatic. Alice, he gets a telegram that she's having the baby. He hands out cigars to all the state lawmakers in Albany, and he gets another telegram that she's ill after having the baby. And he races to New York City, but not in time. She dies. And in the same brownstone, on the same day, his mother dies of typhoid fever. It's Valentine's Day. He is so devastated that he hands the baby over to his sister, Bammy, and says, you have to take care of her. He names her Alice. That's the one time he used the name. And then he goes into a deep depression. His friends write that they were convinced he was going to commit suicide. Convinced. And he pulls out of society. He goes out west to where he had visited once, and somebody told him to buy a ranch to the Dakota Territory in the Badlands. And he lives there for 2 years, essentially finding himself. And that's another chapter of Teddy Roosevelt's life. It's the Dakota Territory Rough Rider folks. He meets cowboys and ranchers and ne'er-do-wells. He gets in fights. He has to take down this guy that has 2 guns in a bar he's convinced he needs to buy the drinks, and he stands up and gives him a right and a left. The guy falls down and hits his head on the bar, and the bar erupts because the guy was obviously a jerk for a long time. They pull him out, and Roosevelt has respect in this group. But he lives there for 2 years in the middle of nowhere. By the way, the Presidential Library is opening up in North Dakota next year, July, and they are very proud. Former governor, now Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, is a huge TR guy and really worked hard to get that library off the ground. So President Trump's going to do a whistle-stop tour heading there on July 3rd. It opens up before the 250th. He's awesome. I had him in the hour special, and he's tremendous. He's really great. Anyway, so why does he obliterate it? There's some people that look at him that he had such depression after that he may have been bipolar. I mean, it's just, he pulled out. Imagine having something bad in your life and then you just pull out of life for 2 years and you go someplace. That's pretty remarkable if you think about it.
You have to be rich to do that.
I guess you have to be rich to do that, yeah.
Now, you say that, quote, the overriding passion that ruled Teddy Roosevelt's life was not his family, but his quest to matter and to make a difference. Now, have those priorities basically been true for all of our great presidents?
Yeah, I think some people put more emphasis on their family and doing big things, but to be consequential is really what drove Teddy Roosevelt in everything he did, to be consequential. And we may talk about it at the end, but it's a good time right now. Fast forward to after his presidency, he goes to Paris, he delivers this speech, the Citizenship in the Republic speech, which becomes known as the Man in the Arena speech. And I think it's really indicative of his life. It's who he was. It is how he thought about things. It's essentially the message of get in the game, take action with your life. And if you permit me, I just want to read this thing because it's not that long. You'd think by now I'd have it memorized, but I don't. But it is crucial to who he was. It kind of captures the spirit of engagement of Roosevelt that he embodied. So he says, it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how strong the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there's no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms. All right? Knows great enthusiasms. And great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Now, he delivers this speech after the presidency. He's in Paris, and it's essentially, again, get in the game. Don't be the person throwing rhetorical grenades at the person who's getting it done. But at the time, I think this speech is about him, and he wants to get back in the game. He wants to get back in the arena. At the time, Taft is the Republican who is running. He's his vice president. And he says, I'm going to run against him. So he runs against him in the primary. He wins 6 states, competes, but he loses. And Taft is the Republican nominee. And Roosevelt decides that he's going to run a third party, the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party, he calls it. And he goes around the country and he gets a lot of attention and he works his friends in the media and he's giving speeches all over the place. And he gives a speech in Milwaukee and an assassin tries to kill him, shoots, and it hits the eyeglass case in his pocket with a 50-page speech, and the bullet goes into his chest. And it doesn't all the way go through, but it goes into his chest, and the blood is pouring out. His shirt is completely blood-stained as he's speaking, and he continues to deliver the speech for 45 minutes in Milwaukee. And he, at the end, says, you see, a bullet can't even take out a bull moose. And finally, they get him off the stage, and they take him to the hospital. But you can imagine, in that environment, how the press is like, holy cow, that was front page news. And by the way, the reason he's president is because McKinley's assassinated in Buffalo, becoming the youngest president at 42. So here he is running a third party, gets shot, continues to go forward. He gets the most votes, more than Ross Perot in 1992. Sorry, I know, Texas. 19.8%. And he actually, obviously, hands the election over to Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat. And in the big picture, Republicans look at that as a very negative thing about Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt, I think, would look back and say that was a mistake, because Woodrow Wilson, from his perspective, was devastating for the world.
In terms of his greatness during his presidency, you've talked about his having resolved the coal strike in 1902. You've talked about him helping resolve the war between Japan and Russia. He also resolved the dispute between France and Germany over Morocco. So he was the ultimate international mediator, peacemaker. Talk about the aspects of his personality that made him such an effective mediator.
Yeah, I think he was persuasive. He was a force of personality. I think that he could be, get a lot of attention, but behind the scenes, he worked across the aisle and worked across countries to bring people together. He also was, very forceful, so he had respect of these international countries. For example, Venezuela, and obviously in the news now as the focus of narco-terrorism and all the action that's going on, at the time was in a horrible political and economic state, and the Great Britain and Germany wanted to get repaid the loans that it gave Venezuela, and they decided to send ships to blockade the country. Well, Roosevelt said, that's not happening in our hemisphere. We are policing this hemisphere, and he threatens to send the Navy out to block the German and British ships. Well, that just moving the ships, turns them around, Great Britain and Germany, and just by that move, they don't do what they're going to do to Venezuela. So basically, he, with his force of personality and his actions, has respect, which makes him a good mediator.
Now, one of his greatest accomplishments, and you mentioned it briefly, was getting the Panama Canal built. And you quote David McCullough for the proposition that, quote, the canal was vital and became the indispensable path to a global destiny for the United States of America. So why was it indispensable to America's global destiny?
By the way, I love McCullough's writing. It's just so succinct, and I quote him a lot in this book. And if you look at all the books, the notes in the back are really detailed. We take a lot of time to make sure that everything is notated. But the Panama Canal, in McKinley's time, they wanted it to go through Nicaragua, and they thought that was a better path, but they could never get Congress to sign on. And there was a lot of battle about why it was important. Should we do it? How much is it going to cost? What are we doing interfering in another country? All this battle, and Congress was not moving forward under McKinley. Roosevelt moves it to Panama, thinks it's a better path, and gets Congress to sign on, and negotiates behind the scenes to have buy-in. Not only that, but again, he brings the press with him as the construction gets underway. And he wants to have the press come with him in the rainy season when it's completely muddy, because he wants to make sure that even in the rainy season that they are continuing to work and use the American dollars completely the way that Congress authorizes it. So he goes down and he's in a white outfit with big boots on, and he's slopping around the mud. He turns brown, but he's walking in the mud of Panama. He sits in an excavator, but he's got this big gaggle of press, and he talks about how important this is going to be for the world. The reason McCullough writes that is because it was important for the world. At that time, trade had to go a long way to get to the U.S., and this was a path where we sped everything up and we could do international trade. It exponentially increased business and made America a financial power.
Now, there are obviously, we've talked about some of the similarities between Teddy Roosevelt and Donald Trump, but there are some differences. In his inaugural address in March of 1905, Roosevelt said, quote, toward all nations, large and small, our attitude must be one of cordial and sincere friendship. We must show not only in our words, but in our deeds, that we are earnestly desirous of securing their goodwill by acting toward them in a spirit of just and generous recognition of all their rights, close quote. So if you were to read those words aloud to President Trump, knowing how much he admires Teddy Roosevelt, how do you think he'd respond?
Not Canada. I don't know how he'd respond. I think, I think it's very strange. He operates in a different place, and we're never going to see a politician like President Trump ever again. I don't care who you say it's going to be, some businessman, some entertainer. I don't care who it is. It will never be like this particular man at this particular time. Now, you can look at him and you can look at this side, which is the actions he's taken and the stuff he's done and all of the bullet points on this side of the paper. And then you can look at this side of the paper and the X posts and the crazy things he says and sometimes over the top, rhetoric about XYZ. And you look at both sides of the paper, and depending on where you stand, you focus on one side or the other side. If you look at the whole of the paper, I think time is going to have to happen. There's not going to be, I'm not diving into a Trump book anytime soon, because I think history needs to digest all that has happened in these two administrations. Understanding he's under fire in the first one, and he's always, nobody's giving him any leeway. Understanding this way, he has a lot more wind at his back, and he's pushing the envelope. So I think time is going to give us some perspective. When Roosevelt says that, he is coming from a point of diplomacy and same message of speak softly first and still carry the big stick. Donald Trump does it differently, but if you can see echoes of that in some of the things he does when he talks about leaders. He is a force of personality when he meets on these world stage with global leaders. If you've seen him in the room, they all are like drawn to him like bugs to a bug zapper in the backyard. I mean, they are like flying to the light. And he is the guy that moves the needle in all of these international places. And I've talked to these leaders, and they go in saying, we can't stand this guy. He's horrible. What he says, it's just so rude. And they come out of the room, and they're like, wow, very nice. It was wonderful. We really enjoyed it. And so I think he does it differently, but there's still echoes of what Roosevelt was talking about.
I'll close this interview. We'll have time for a few questions from the audience. But with what you close your book, with a chapter titled, quote, The Idea of Roosevelt. You say that per his famous speech about the strenuous life, he still, quote, embodies the idea of America as it was meant to be. And his definition of the strenuous life is a rallying cry for a nation on the brink of global greatness, close quote. So with that statement, if Teddy Roosevelt and Donald Trump were in the same room, and it would obviously have to be a very big room to hold those two enormous egos, do you think the room would be filled with positive energy or negative energy?
Oh, positive. They would get along, I think. I envision them getting along, bully to you, and he would say, love the glasses. It's a good look for you. But I think they would really get along, and there would be mutual respect. And that's what I envision. I think if you look at his life overall, it does fit those speeches, the beginning strenuous life and the bookend of Citizen in the Republic, Man in the Arena. He's a doer. President Trump's a doer too, but he's a doer. Teddy Roosevelt's a doer. And, I just think it's amazing to look at his life. The youngest president at 42, he dies at 60. He dies after a crazy trip down South America, the River of Doubt. He gets malaria, he gets sick, but he comes back and he's bucking back up. But then his son, Quentin, dies is killed as a fighter pilot in World War I. And after all the devastation, the father, the mother, the wife, it's the son and his death that really throws him over the edge. And he doesn't pull away to the Dakota territories. He dies. And it really is that despair, I think, at the end that kills him. But at 60, in Sagamore Hill, when he dies in his sleep, he is the leading candidate for the next election in 20. And so you think about that and how history, could have been changed in a number of different ways. But I think this book, I'm proud of all the books, but this book is a fast read. I think you can admit to that. And I'm really proud of the blurbs from historians. I call myself a reporter of history, but some of these people who've read it, Doris Kearns Goodwin and Walter Isaacson, Jay Winnick, they've really gave some great blurbs, and I'm really excited about it, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. I'm happy to take questions.
Who's got a question for Bret? Yes,
sir.
Would you stand, please, so we can all hear you?
Yeah. With respect to the room that Mike told them both, maybe a ballroom, making America great.
Yeah, great question. McKinley is formidable, and it's definitely present in President Trump's mind. He's talked about it, obviously, the focus on tariffs and how McKinley makes the country, in his mind, Trump's mind, a lot of money, and Teddy Roosevelt's the one that spent it. But he likes Teddy Roosevelt for his force of personality and how he gets things done. He respects McKinley for that policy, as well as his business acumen. The two for presidents are a focus for President Trump. He's got McKinley on the wall in the Oval Office. He's got a bust of Teddy Roosevelt. It's there in his mind, that time. And it's interesting that handover, when McKinley is assassinated, Roosevelt is sworn in, and he tells the McKinley cabinet that I am going to be a McKinley guy. I'm going to be a McKinley policy guy. You are all keeping your jobs. And he steps into the presidency at 42. That lasts a few months, and he becomes his own guy and becomes much more progressive than McKinley would have been, much more engaged in a lot of things, especially labor on that front. The ironic part is that when he leaves office, Taft takes over, and he says, listen, you got to follow all the policies, and he's convinced Taft will. And not long after that, Taft is his own man, much more conservative, much more in the traditional Republican mold back then, and it infuriates Roosevelt, even though he was exactly that way when he took over from McKinley.
Yes, over here. Would you stand up, please?
For saving the wildlife of America.
Yeah, it's in the book. A long list of accomplishments as far as especially bison and a long list of animals. He was a hunter, but had his instinct was conservation and thinking that he could save large swaths of America and for natural resources, but also for the animals. That trip in Africa with Kermit is unbelievable, and he writes several books about these trips, about the animals, the flora, the fauna, that still to this day are really readable about all of that. He's obviously respected by the hunters associations around the country, but he's also really lifted up as conservation and environmentalist. Secretary Burgum, former Governor Burgum, looks at it not just from the conservation and environmental point. He thinks that Roosevelt was thinking forward about protecting natural resources like minerals and energy and coal and all of these things, protecting it for the long term so that it wasn't just used and abused early on. So as you go around the country, there are more than 160 specific parks that have tribute to Teddy Roosevelt, but there's many, many more that he signed with those 1,300 executive orders.
Yeah, not many people realize it, but Theodore Roosevelt, like Winston Churchill's main source of income in his adult life was from writing books.
Well, you wanted to follow up? Sorry.
Just a follow-up. He started the Boone and Crockett Club, which is one of the largest and oldest conservation organizations.
And still around, yeah.
Still around. I'm one of the
Oh, well, there you go. I figured this knowledge came from somewhere.
Actually, Donald Trump Jr. is a 100 member too.
Okay, good.
We're still in the controversy.
There you go. There's another similarity with Trump.
Yes. Lane.
Brad, we're so glad to have you back in Dallas, so you just keep coming and you keep writing.
Yes, ma'am.
I heard your interview with Mark Levin, and it was fantastic.
He's a great guy, and he's also loves history, which is fun to, I'm honored to be on his show.
So what do you think that Teddy Roosevelt's advice would be to Donald Trump? And then one other little personal note, what wine did you drink while you were writing this book?
That's so good. It is true. That is my process. I have a glass of wine. I set aside 2 hours at night, and I've told the story here before, but I have this great researcher, Sidney Soderberg, who is the former mayor of Salina, Kansas, and I found her in the first book about Eisenhower, and she came up to me at the beginning and said, I'm willing to do this. I really want to do this. I watch your show. And I said, wow, that's good. And I like your show. And I said, that's even better. And she said, but I need you to know that I am a true blue Kansas Democrat. And I said, that's good, because I'm a news guy trying to write history, and I don't care about your politics. Can you find me some nuggets of history? And she plants herself in these national archives and libraries and finds these real nuggets that have not been out there, or at least were undercovered or history looked over. And so we take that, and it's a process with my co-author, and we bounce back and forth. But my process involves a glass of red wine, usually a blend, and it sits there on the desk, and I spend 2 hours at night. And my family, fortunately, allows me to do it in the writing season. It takes about 1.5 years, so 2 years total for each one of these big books to come out. But I have a book coming out in June of next year that I can tell you here. It's called The Case for America, and it's a compilation of all 6 presidents, plus interviews with really interesting people around the world to make the case in front of a jury of your peers why America is a great place and continues to be, despite all of its detractions and all of its problems. And The Case for America is going to come out in June of 26, ahead of the 250th. So,
Well, we hope you come to Dallas for it.
yeah, but to your first question, he probably would say dial back the aggressive stuff. He'd say be yourself, but maybe be nicer.
One last question.
So good. Great question. So that Tehran conference is fascinating because Churchill is really upset that FDR is giving any deference to Stalin. And Stalin is kind of working FDR at that time. And there are real similarities between Putin and Stalin and FDR and Trump, because every phone call that Putin makes, we're definitely going to make peace. We're just one meeting away, and I think Secretary Rubio prevented this next meeting in Hungary. Churchill was the realist of the moment and believed Stalin was a real threat. And I think inside this administration there are those realists who are telling President Trump, listen, this is a former KGB officer who is working you. And he's not going to get to the table unless you put significant pressure on him. And so that's where I think we are. This meeting in the next few hours with President Xi is fascinating and consequential, and is probably the biggest meeting that we've seen with President Trump, in part because Xi holds the key to pressuring Russia on Ukraine. India did it. Missiles and support for Ukraine did it, but not enough. China would really move the needle. So those similarities are definitely there. In the end, FDR kind of punted, and Stalin goes on to, Soviet domination after that.
Carl, you had a question?
Yes, so you've been on an absolute roll with interviews. I've seen some of the best things I've seen in the last 5-6 years of people you can get. Who would you say is your most consequential interview? Ones that you didn't think you could get, but, I mean, the most important interview you've done?
Yeah. So it took me about 6 months to get the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS. And when I finally did that interview, I told all of them that I was going to ask tough but fair questions. He would have plenty of time to answer. We went over there, and the night before the interview, they said he has to do it in Arabic. And I had negotiated all along in English conversation. I went to the palace and talked to him at 3 a.m. For 2 hours about everything. And so we were pulling our hair out, and so we got a translator in the corner of the room, and I put my earpiece in, and I asked the first question, and it came back in English. And I asked the second question, and it came back in English. And the translator's in my ear, I don't have anything for you. And I know, he's speaking English. Anyway, so it was an hour-long interview, but I think it was really consequential, and he's going to be a leader in that region for 50 years. He's a young leader. I am close, knock on wood, to a interview with President Xi, and they are on the cusp. We'll see how this meeting goes. It may determine whether I get the interview or not, but I think that getting world leaders at this time, with all that's happening around the world, fast-moving AI, energy, all kinds of questions, that's a really good thing. So we are invested in that, and Fox has given me that ability. So we're striving to get the next big interview all the time. The most fun interview was in Cuba. Jimmy Buffett was on the back porch of the Hotel Nacional, and after a long day of reporting, I sat down with Jimmy Buffett and talked for a while. But he said I had to smoke a cigar and drink a margarita, so I did.
I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to Bret, and thank you to the Dallas Historical Society. We hope everybody had a great time. You all should have your signed books. Bret will be here for a few more minutes if you'd like for him to personalize it. But Bret, great luck. We hope you hit number 1 at 7 p.m. and we'll be pulling for you.
Thank you, Talmage, very much, as always.
Bret Baier is much more than a solid news anchor. He's now written 6 fine books on the presidency, including Presidents Theodore Roosevelt, George Washington, Ulysses Grant, Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, and Ronald Reagan. And I've interviewed Bret on all of these books. Make sure you catch all my podcasts published and promoted by the Dallas Morning News on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, and the Washington Independent Review of Books website. This is Talmage Boston with my podcast series, Cross-Examining History. Thanks for listening.